When Natalie suggested the weekend getaway, I couldn't say no. Things between us had been tense for months, quietly strained in a way that neither of us dared to name. A weekend at a vineyard sounded like the perfect escape, a chance to reconnect without the distractions of work, phones, or the demands of everyday life. She picked the place. A sprawling vineyard nestled in the hills about 3 hours outside the city. She showed me pictures online. A grand stone chateau surrounded by rows of grapevines that stretched as far as the eye could see. It looked like something out of a travel magazine, the kind of place where couples toast to anniversaries and whisper sweet nothings under starlit skies. "It'll be good for us," Natalie had said, her eyes searching mine. "Just the two of us." I'd agreed, hoping she was right. After 12 years of marriage, we needed this, whatever this was. I wanted to believe that the quiet moments we'd lost could be found somewhere between those vines. That maybe, just maybe, we'd leave the vineyard as something closer to the couple we used to be. The drive there was uneventful. Natalie hummed along to the radio, her fingers drumming on the armrest as I navigated the winding roads. She seemed lighter than she'd been in weeks, her shoulders relaxed, her laughter softer. I tried to match her mood, but the nagging sense that something was off lingered in the back of my mind. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the vineyard. The air smelled like lavender and fresh earth, and the chateau was even more impressive in person, its ivy-covered walls glowing in the golden light. A young woman greeted us at the reception desk, her smile warm as she handed us the keys to our room and a pamphlet of activities. "Welcome to Maison de Vigne," she said. "We hope you enjoy your stay." Our room was on the second floor, with a balcony overlooking the vineyard. It was spacious and elegant, with polished wooden floors, a canopy bed draped in white linens, and a bottle of wine waiting for us on the table. "This is incredible," Natalie said, spinning in a slow circle as she took it all in. "Isn't it perfect?" "It's beautiful," I agreed, setting our bags down by the wardrobe. She crossed the room and slid the balcony doors open, stepping outside to lean against the railing. I joined her, the cool evening breeze brushing against my skin as we looked out over the endless rows of grapevines. For a moment, it felt like the beginning of something. The start of a weekend where we could leave everything behind and remember what it was like to just be us. "I'm glad we came," I said, slipping an arm around her waist. "Me too," she replied, leaning into me. Dinner that night was served on a terrace overlooking the vineyard, the tables lit by candlelight and the soft glow of string lights overhead. The food was exquisite, perfectly grilled lamb paired with a rich red wine that I couldn't pronounce but couldn't stop drinking. Natalie was radiant, her cheeks flushed from the wine and her laughter coming easily. For the first time in months, it felt like we were in sync again, the tension between us fading into the background. "This place is magical," she said, raising her glass to mine. "Thank you for coming here with me." "Thank you for finding it," I replied, clinking my glass against hers. As the night went on, the terrace emptied, and it was just the two of us lingering over dessert. Natalie's hand rested on mine, her eyes sparkling in the candlelight. "This is what we needed," she said softly. "A fresh start." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that a weekend away could fix everything. The next morning, we joined a small group for a tour of the vineyard. The owner himself led the tour, a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and a charming smile. His name was Julian, and he had a way of commanding attention without trying, his deep voice weaving effortlessly between anecdotes about winemaking and the history of the vineyard. Natalie seemed captivated by him, hanging on his every word as he led us through the rows of grapevines. I didn't think much of it at first. Julian had the kind of charisma that drew people in, and Natalie had always been a curious person, eager to learn. But as the tour went on, I noticed the way her laughter lingered a little too long at his jokes, the way her eyes lit up when he smiled at her. A flicker of unease passed through me, but I pushed it aside. She was just enjoying herself. That's what we were here for, wasn't it? By the time the tour ended, the sun was high in the sky, and Julian invited us to join him for a private tasting in the cellar. "It's a rare treat," he said, flashing a grin that seemed to charm everyone in the group. A chance to try some vintages we don't offer to the public. Natalie's eyes lit up, and she turned to me, her excitement palpable. What do you think? Sure, I said, though the unease in my chest hadn't entirely subsided. The cellar was cool and dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of oak barrels and aging wine. Julian poured generous glasses of deep red wine, explaining the nuances of each vintage as we sipped. Natalie seemed particularly interested in the process, asking question after question about the grapes, the barrels, the fermentation. Julian answered each one with an easy charm, his gaze lingering on her just a little too long. I tried to focus on the wine, on the experience, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. There was an energy between them, subtle, but unmistakable. Later that evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the sunset, Natalie seemed distant. She swirled her glass of wine absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Everything okay? I asked, breaking the silence. Yeah, she said quickly, flashing me a smile. Just tired. I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The sunlight spilled into the room in golden streaks, illuminating the crumpled sheets beside me. Natalie was already gone. I lay there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she should have been. She'd always been an early riser, especially on vacations, so it wasn't unusual. Still, the bed felt colder than it should have, and I couldn't shake the vague sense of unease that had settled over me the day before. I found her downstairs, seated on the patio with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She was chatting with Julian, her posture relaxed and her smile effortless. They looked up as I approached, and Julian greeted me with a nod and his usual charm. Good morning, Jason, he said. Your wife was just asking me about the vineyard's expansion plans. Natalie smiled up at me, her face glowing in the soft morning light. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd get some air, she explained, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. Join us? Sure, I said, though the tension in my chest was already tightening. Julian launched into a story about the challenges of running a vineyard, his voice warm and engaging. Natalie hung on every word, her gaze fixed on him in a way that made my stomach churn. I sipped my coffee in silence, trying to brush off the growing discomfort. When Julian excused himself to tend to the vineyard, Natalie turned to me with a bright smile. Isn't this place amazing? She said. It's beautiful, I replied, keeping my voice even. You seem to really like Julian. Her smile faltered, just for a second. He's fascinating, she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. You don't meet people like him every day. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. We took a walk through the vineyard, stopping to take photos and marvel at the scenery. Natalie seemed genuinely happy, her laughter filling the air as we wandered through the rows of vines. For a while, it felt like things were normal again, like the tension I'd been feeling was all in my head. But then came the afternoon. While I was in the tasting room chatting with some other guests, Natalie disappeared. I assumed she'd gone back to the room or stepped outside for some fresh air, but when I returned to the patio, she was nowhere to be found. I wandered the grounds for a while, my unease growing with every passing minute. When I finally spotted her, she was standing near the edge of the vineyard, her back to me. Julian was with her, his posture casual as he leaned against a nearby fence. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying on the breeze. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sight of them together, the easy familiarity between them, made my chest tighten. Hey, I called out as I approached. They both turned, their laughter fading. There you are, Natalie said, her smile bright but slightly strained. I was just asking Julian about the history of this section of the vineyard. Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. Your wife has quite the curiosity, he said smoothly. I forced a smile, though I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. She does, I said. That's one of the things I love about her. The words felt heavy as they left my mouth, like I was trying to remind both of us why we were here. That evening, during dinner, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. The way she'd smiled at Julian, the way he'd looked at her, like they shared a secret I wasn't privy to. Natalie seemed oblivious to my unease, chatting happily about the wine pairings and the dessert menu. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. After dinner, we returned to our room. Natalie slipped into the bathroom to change, and I stood on the balcony, staring out at the moonlit vineyard. The air was cool, but my thoughts felt suffocating. When she joined me a few minutes later, she placed a hand on my arm, her touch warm and familiar. "You've been quiet tonight," she said softly. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, debating whether to voice my concerns. "Nothing," I said finally. "Just tired, I guess." She nodded, leaning against me. "This weekend has been so nice, hasn't it?" "Yeah," I said, though the words felt hollow. The next day, we joined another group activity, a hands-on winemaking workshop led by Julian. Natalie was eager to participate, her enthusiasm contagious as she rolled up her sleeves and dove into the process. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my attention kept drifting to her and Julian. They worked side by side, laughing and exchanging glances that felt too intimate for comfort. At one point, Julian placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her through a particular technique. The gesture was casual, but the way she leaned into it sent a jolt of anger through me. That night, as we sat in the tasting room with a group of guests, I excused myself to use the restroom. When I returned, Natalie and Julian were gone. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind as I searched the room, then stepped outside into the cool night air. The courtyard was empty, but faint voices carried from somewhere nearby. I followed the sound, my heart pounding as I turned the corner and found them standing near the edge of the vineyard. They were close, too close, and Julian's hand rested lightly on her arm. I froze, watching as Natalie laughed softly, her gaze locked on his. My chest tightened, the weight of suspicion threatening to crush me. I didn't confront them then. Instead, I turned and walked back to the tasting room, my thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and anger. I needed to be sure, to have proof before I said anything. That night, as Natalie slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Natalie humming softly in the bathroom. The melody was unfamiliar, but there was a lightness to it that felt out of place. She'd been radiant this entire trip, happier, freer, but it only made the knot in my stomach tighten. For years, I'd been the one to make her laugh like that. I'd been the one she leaned into, the one she looked at with eyes full of affection. Now, that light in her seemed to glow brightest when she was with Julian. At breakfast, she seemed more animated than ever, chatting about the day's plans and the activities the vineyard offered. I watched her closely, taking in the way she smiled, the way she laughed easily at nothing in particular. It wasn't like her to be this giddy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just the charm of the vineyard. "What's on the agenda today?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "There's a private wine pairing session this afternoon," she said, buttering her toast. "Julian mentioned it yesterday. It's supposed to be incredible. We should go." I hesitated, the mention of his name setting my nerves on edge. "Sure," I said finally. "Why not?" The morning passed uneventfully. We wandered through the vineyard again, took some photos, and even stopped by the gift shop to pick up a bottle of wine to bring home. Natalie was cheerful and affectionate, slipping her hand into mine and leaning her head on my shoulder as we walked. But every so often, I caught her glancing at her phone, her expression unreadable. It was subtle, just a quick check before slipping it back into her pocket, but it was enough to set off alarm bells in my mind. By the time we arrived at the wine pairing session, my unease had reached a boiling point. The event was held in a private room off the main cellar, the table set with an array of wines and small plates. Julian greeted us warmly, his easy smile and confident charm on full display. "It's good to see you again," he said, his eyes lingering on Natalie for just a moment too long. "Thanks for hosting this," I said, forcing a polite smile. As the session began, Julian explained each wine in detail, pairing it with carefully chosen bites designed to enhance the flavors. Natalie asked questions, her interest genuine and her smile bright. I tried to focus on the wines, on the experience, but my attention kept drifting back to the two of them. There was an ease between them, an unspoken connection that felt impossible to ignore. After the session, Julian invited us to stay for a tour of the cellar. Natalie agreed eagerly, and I followed along, my chest tight with a mix of suspicion and dread. The cellar was cool and dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of oak and aging wine. Julian led us through the rows of barrels, his voice rich and smooth as he shared stories about the vineyard's history. At one point, Natalie lagged behind, her eyes scanning the barrels with a look of wonder. I stayed close, watching as Julian stepped back to join her. "Do you have any questions?" he asked, his voice low. She smiled, tilting her head slightly. "Just admiring the craftsmanship," she said. Their voices were soft, their words too quiet for me to fully hear. But the way they stood, close enough for their shoulders to brush, set my teeth on edge. That evening, after dinner, Natalie excused herself to get some fresh air. I nodded, pretending to be engrossed in the dessert menu, but as soon as she was out of sight, I followed her. I kept my distance, staying in the shadows as she made her way toward the edge of the vineyard. She stopped near the same spot where I'd seen her and Julian the night before, her phone in hand. A few moments later, Julian appeared, his posture relaxed as he approached her. My chest tightened as I watched them exchange words, their voices too low for me to hear. She laughed softly, her hand brushing against his arm. And then, before I could process what was happening, he leaned in and kissed her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a painful reminder of what I was seeing. I wanted to look away, to turn and walk back to the room and pretend this wasn't happening. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the woman I'd loved for 12 years betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. When they finally parted, Natalie's expression was a mix of guilt and longing. Julian said something that made her smile, and she nodded before turning and walking back toward the chateau. I waited until she was out of sight before stepping out of the shadows. Julian stood there for a moment, his back to me, completely unaware of my presence. "Enjoying yourself?" I said, my voice cold and sharp. He turned, his expression shifting from surprise to something resembling defiance. "Jason," he said, his tone measured. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Clearly," I replied, my fists clenching at my sides. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the tension between us crackling like static electricity. "What do you want me to say?" Julian asked finally, his voice calm. "That I regret it? Because I don't." His words hit me like a slap to the face, and before I could stop myself, I stepped forward, my fist connecting with his jaw. He stumbled back, his hand going to his face as he looked at me with a mix of shock and anger. "Stay away from my wife," I said, my voice shaking with rage. He didn't reply, and I turned on my heel, walking back toward the chateau with my mind racing. When I reached the room, Natalie was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed with a distant look in her eyes. "Did you enjoy your walk?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. She looked up, her expression shifting from confusion to panic as she saw the look on my face. "Jason, don't," I said, cutting her off. "I know." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of her guilt. Natalie sat frozen on the edge of the bed, her face pale and her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. I stood in the doorway, my chest heaving, the image of her and Julian burned into my mind. "Jason," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," I said sharply, holding up a hand to stop her. "Don't even try." She flinched, her shoulders hunching like she'd been struck. "It's not what you think," she said quickly, desperation lacing her voice. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "Not what I think?" "Then by all means, Natalie, enlighten me. What exactly was I seeing out there? Because it looked like my wife, the mother of my children, kissing another man?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her hands. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "A mistake," I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "You call that a mistake? A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. What you did out there was a choice. Her tears spilled over, streaking her cheeks, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for her. Not now. I swear, Jason, it didn't mean anything, she said, her voice breaking. I shook my head, anger and disbelief swirling inside me. Didn't mean anything? I snapped. So you're telling me you risked everything, our marriage, our family, for nothing? She looked up at me then, her expression raw and full of guilt. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said. But you did, I said, my voice low but steady. You didn't just hurt me, Natalie. You destroyed us. The silence that followed was deafening. She wiped at her tears, her hands trembling, but I didn't move to comfort her. How long? I asked finally, my voice cold. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the window as if she could escape the question. How long? I repeated, my tone sharper. Just this weekend, she said softly. It started here. I swear, Jason, it wasn't planned. It just happened. Don't give me that, I said, my anger flaring again. Things like this don't just happen, Natalie. You made a choice. You let it happen. She opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it, her gaze dropping to her lap. I turned away, pacing the room as I tried to process what she'd said. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and I had to force myself to take deep breaths to keep from shouting. We came here to fix things, I said finally, my voice trembling with emotion. I agreed to this trip because I thought we needed a reset. I thought you wanted to work on us. But the whole time, you were? I broke off, unable to finish the sentence. I did want to work on us, she said, her voice pleading. I still do. I stopped pacing and turned to face her, my eyes narrowing. You have a funny way of showing it. The weight of the situation pressed down on me like a physical force. I thought about the life we'd built together, the years of memories, the home we'd created, the plans we'd made for the future. And now, all of it felt like it had been built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath me. I can't do this right now, I said finally, my voice hoarse. I need to think. Jason, please, she said, standing and taking a hesitant step toward me. I shook my head, stepping back. Don't. Just don't. She stopped, her arms wrapping around herself as if to hold herself together. I left the room, the walls feeling too close, the air too thick to breathe. The hallway was empty, the quiet punctuated only by the soft hum of distant conversation from the other guests. I found myself outside, the cool night air biting against my skin. The vineyard stretched out before me, the rows of grapevines bathed in pale moonlight. It was beautiful, serene even, but I couldn't appreciate it. All I could think about was the betrayal, the way Natalie had looked at Julian, the way she'd kissed him, the lies she told without hesitation. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring into the dark. My mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to. Was this the first time? Could I ever trust her again? Was there anything left to save? When I finally returned to the room, Natalie was sitting on the bed, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen. Jason, she said softly, her voice tentative. I'm sleeping on the couch, I said flatly, not giving her a chance to respond. Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. I grabbed a pillow and a blanket from the closet and made my way to the living room. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts churned endlessly, a toxic mix of anger, hurt, and confusion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, their bodies close, their faces lit by the glow of the moonlight. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same. The next day, we packed in silence. Natalie tried to make small talk a few times, but I shut it down with curt responses. I couldn't pretend everything was fine. As we loaded the car, Julian appeared, his confident demeanor noticeably absent. He looked at me, then at Natalie, and for a moment, I thought he might try to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. Stay away from us, I said coldly, my voice leaving no room for argument. He nodded once, his expression unreadable, and walked away. The drive home was suffocating. Natalie sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap. I couldn't bring myself to look at her, my focus fixed on the road ahead. When we finally pulled into the driveway, she turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. Jason, Don't, I said, cutting her off. We'll talk later. Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded, stepping out of the car and heading inside. I stayed in the car for a long time, staring at the house we'd built together. The place that was supposed to be our sanctuary, our safe haven. Now, it felt like a prison, a reminder of everything I'd lost. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The life we'd had was gone, and there was no going back. The house was eerily quiet in the days that followed our return. Natalie and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was only about the essentials: work schedules, errands, and the kids. Every conversation felt forced, the weight of her betrayal hanging over us like a storm cloud. At night, I slept on the couch, the ache in my back nothing compared to the ache in my chest. The bed I used to share with Natalie felt like a distant memory, a place I couldn't bring myself to return to. I hadn't confronted her again since the vineyard. I didn't know what to say, or even what I wanted. Part of me longed for answers, for some kind of explanation that could make sense of it all. But another part of me was afraid of what I might hear. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room pretending to watch TV, Natalie appeared in the doorway. She looked hesitant, her arms crossed over her chest as she leaned against the frame. Jason, she began, her voice soft. We need to talk. I didn't look at her, my eyes fixed on the screen. About what? About us, she said, stepping into the room. I sighed, muting the TV and turning to face her. Okay, talk. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. I'm sorry, she said finally, for everything, for hurting you, for betraying your trust, for all of it. I stared at her, my emotions warring beneath the surface. Why? I asked, my voice low. Why did you do it? She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. I don't know, she said quietly. I've been feeling lost, stuck, like I've been living someone else's life instead of my own. That's not an excuse, I said sharply. I know, she said quickly, looking up at me with tears in her eyes. I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm just trying to explain. I've been struggling for a long time, Jason. And when I met Julian, he made me feel alive again, like I was more than just a wife or a mother. Her words felt like a punch to the gut, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. And what about me? I asked. What about the life we built together? Didn't that mean anything to you? Of course it did, she said, her voice breaking. It still does. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself and I didn't know how to tell you. I shook my head, my anger flaring. So instead of talking to me, you turned to him? You let him come between us? I didn't plan for it to happen, she said, her tears falling freely now. It was a mistake, one I regret more than you'll ever know. Her regret was written all over her face, but it did little to ease the pain in my chest. Regret doesn't fix this, Natalie, I said, my voice tight. It doesn't undo what you did. She nodded, her shoulders slumping. I know, she said softly. I want to make it right. I want to fix this. The sincerity in her voice gave me pause, but I couldn't ignore the doubts swirling in my mind. Could I ever trust her again? Could we ever go back to the way things were before the vineyard? I need time, I said finally, my voice heavy. I need time to figure out if this is even something I can move past. She nodded, wiping at her tears. I understand, she said. Take all the time you need. The next few weeks were a blur of awkward conversations and careful distance. We continued coexisting under the same roof, but the gap between us felt insurmountable. Every time I looked at her, I saw the vineyard. I saw Julian. I saw the life we built together crumbling to pieces. One evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, Ellie looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. Daddy, she said, her voice soft, why are you sleeping on the couch? Her question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Mommy and I are just figuring some things out, I said finally. Are you mad at her? She asked, her gaze searching mine. No, I lied, forcing a smile. Sometimes grown-ups just need time to talk about things. She nodded, seeming to accept my answer, and I kissed her forehead before turning off the light. But as I walked out of her room, her question echoed in my mind, the weight of it pressing down on me. It was Emma who finally gave me the clarity I needed. She was a friend I'd confided in over the years, a steady presence who always seemed to know the right thing to say. "You need to ask yourself what you want," she said one afternoon over coffee. "Not what's expected of you, not what's easiest, but what you really want." I nodded, her words sinking in. "I don't know if I can forgive her," I admitted. "Then maybe it's time to stop trying to force it," she said gently. "You've done everything you can, Jason. The rest is up to her." That night, as Natalie and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table, I knew what I had to do. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice steady but firm. She looked up at me, her eyes widening. "What do you mean?" "I mean us," I said. "I've tried to move past what happened, but I can't. It's not fair to me, and it's not fair to the kids." Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hands as tears filled her eyes. "Jason, please," she said, her voice breaking. "We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes." "I know you will," I said softly, "but it's not enough. Too much has happened, Natalie. I can't go back to the way things were." The conversation that followed was painful, but it was also honest in a way we hadn't been with each other in years. By the end of it, we both knew the truth. Our marriage was over. We agreed to separate, with me staying in the house for the sake of the kids. Natalie would move out and take some time to figure out her next steps. It wasn't the outcome either of us had hoped for, but it felt like the only path forward. The night she left, I stood in the doorway, watching as she carried her bags to the car. She turned to me one last time, her expression full of sadness and regret. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know," I replied. And with that, she was gone. The morning after Natalie moved out, the house felt like a shell of its former self. It wasn't just her absence that made it feel empty. It was the weight of everything that had been lost. 12 years of marriage, countless shared memories, and a life we had built together were now scattered across the ruins of a relationship that couldn't be salvaged. I stared out the kitchen window as the coffee brewed, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The yard where Ellie and Ben used to play together now felt like a monument to a simpler time, before secrets and lies fractured everything. The kids adjusted to the new arrangement better than I expected, though there were moments when their sadness peeked through. Ellie, ever the curious one, asked questions I struggled to answer. "Why doesn't Mommy live here anymore?" Or, "Are you and Mommy still friends?" I gave her careful, measured responses, doing my best to shield her from the full truth. "Mommy and I both love you very much," I told her one night as I tucked her into bed. "We're just living in different houses now." Ben was quieter, his emotions harder to read. He clung to me a little tighter at bedtime and spent more time drawing in his room, his small brow furrowed with concentration. When I peeked over his shoulder one evening, I saw he was drawing a picture of our family, stick figures with smiles, all holding hands. "Looks great, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "Thanks," he said quietly, his eyes staying on the paper. My own adjustment was a slower, more painful process. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house felt oppressive, and I often found myself replaying the events of the vineyard in my mind, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Work became my escape, a way to drown out the noise in my head. I took on extra projects, staying late at the office more often than not. Mark, my coworker and closest friend, started dropping by unannounced, bringing takeout and sitting with me in the living room. "You've been through hell," he said one evening, balancing a beer on the armrest of the couch. "But you're handling it better than most people would." I shrugged, not sure if I believed him. "It doesn't feel that way." "Well, you are," he said firmly. "And your kids are lucky to have you. Don't forget that." It was Emma, though, who helped me see things in a different light. She had continued babysitting the kids, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos. One evening, after the kids were in bed, she sat across from me at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "You've been putting everyone else first," she said gently. "But what about you, Jason? What do you need?" The question caught me off guard, and I stared at her, unsure how to respond. "I don't know," I admitted finally. I've been so focused on keeping things together for the kids, I haven't really thought about it. Emma smiled, her gaze kind but firm. Maybe it's time you did. Her words stayed with me, and over the next few weeks, I started to carve out small moments for myself. I took up running again, something I hadn't done since college, and joined a local running group. The physical exertion was cathartic, and the group gave me a sense of community I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I also started therapy, something I'd avoided for far too long. Sitting in that office, talking to someone who didn't know me or my history, felt strange at first, but as the weeks went on, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. I feel like I failed, I admitted during one session, like I wasn't enough for her. My therapist, a calm, steady man named Dr. Harris, shook his head. Infidelity is never about the person who's been betrayed, he said. It's about the choices of the person who betrayed them. You didn't cause this, Jason, and you're not responsible for fixing it. Gradually, I began to believe him. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old boxes in the garage, I came across a photo album from our early years of marriage. Flipping through the pages, I saw snapshots of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Our honeymoon, our first apartment, holidays spent laughing with family. For a moment, I felt a pang of grief for the life we'd lost. But as I closed the album and set it aside, I realized something important. That life wasn't mine anymore. And that was okay. The first time I saw Natalie after the separation, it was for Ellie's school play. She arrived just before the show started, her smile hesitant as she waved at me from across the auditorium. We sat a few rows apart, the distance between us a physical representation of the emotional gap that couldn't be bridged. After the play, Ellie ran to both of us, her excitement bubbling over. "Did you see me? Did you see?" she asked, her eyes bright. "You were amazing," I said, lifting her into my arms. Natalie nodded, her smile genuine. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart." It was a bittersweet moment, one that reminded me that while our marriage was over, we would always be connected through our children. As time went on, I found myself looking forward instead of backward. The pain of Natalie's betrayal lingered, but it no longer consumed me. I focused on building a new life for myself and the kids, one filled with laughter, love, and moments of quiet joy. Emma continued to be a constant presence, her friendship a source of strength and comfort. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the kids play in the yard, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road to this moment had been long and painful, but it had led me here, a place where I could finally breathe again. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough.